as we begin to look at blood in the bloodstream, I'd like to give you a brief overview of, right now, blood as you would collect it in, say, a test tube in the lab, where usually they will be spinning that blood in a centrifuge, and settling to the bottom will be your red blood cells. Now, depending on whether or not you're male or female, this amount due to red blood cells, it could be as low as 37% or as high as 54%. That is the percent of the total. The plasma up here is approximately 60%, but again, that depends on how many red blood cells you have. This is called the hematocrit. And they do measure your hematocrit to give you, or to give the caretakers, an idea of whether or not you're in the normal range. So for women it's a little bit lower, for men it's a little bit higher. If it gets too high, then they'll begin to become suspicious that maybe you're having some sort of artificial production of red blood cells from your bone marrow. And that kind of a drug is banned, especially for endurance athletes, because these red blood cells are for carrying oxygen. Erythrocytes, they carry oxygen. So for red muscles, for example, those deliver the oxygen. Now, there will be a tiny layer here called a buffy coat or a white blood cell layer. It also includes platelets. It's usually less than 1%. And those are leukocytes and platelets. We are not going to talk about leukocytes here, because leukocytes, white blood cells, will be discussed in a separate video dealing with the immune system. We are not going to discuss erythrocytes here, because red blood cells will be discussed in a separate video talking about hemoglobin and oxygen transport in the blood. Right now I want to focus on platelets, but before we get there, could you please remember your anatomy, which is that, oops, I forgot to label the plasma here. And keep in mind what you already know about plasma. It's the watery part of your blood. It has all of the ions in it and your dissolved nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, lipids, lipoproteins, all of that stuff is dissolved in the plasma. Vitamins, minerals. But remember, blood cells, all of them, are from the bone marrow. And that is able to be adjusted depending on the needs of the body. For example, if you go to altitude, high altitude, then your body is going to say, I need more red blood cells. So the message will come over here to the bone marrow saying, make more red blood cells at that time. Now, if you have an infection or something, then the message will come to the bone marrow saying, make more white blood cells or leukocytes. But in general, what we have coming out of the bone marrow with no unusual circumstances is going to be 25% of the cells are red blood cells or erythrocytes, and 75% are white blood cells. That is because these have a short lifespan. Some of them only live a few hours or days, and red blood cells have a longer lifespan. They can live to be approximately 4 months old. So that's 120 days. These, depending on what the leukocyte is, might live only a few hours. Technically, memory cells, which are memory B cells, memory T cells, should live forever, but you should probably get your boosters. I'd like to talk about platelets, because platelets are involved in clotting, well, the clotting process. And if you remember from your anatomy, when we have blood vessels, the innermost layer is the endothelium, and that is what is actually in contact with the blood, endothelium. Then you have a layer out here, which is collagen. It strengthens, it's a protein that strengthens the blood vessels. Of course, I'm not talking about capillaries here because capillaries are only endothelium, but any other blood vessel that has more than just endothelium will have a layer of collagen here. And then if you keep moving on out, you'll have smooth muscle and a layer of fibrous connective tissue. Right now, I just want to focus on the collagen because if you have a rupture in your blood vessel, for some reason it broke, now your collagen is exposed. And that sets off a whole pathway of events to prevent blood leaking out of this hole. If the blood leaks out of this hole, then obviously you're losing blood and you only have approximately 5 liters of blood in the human body, and that's not very much. So you can't fill up all your capillaries with the blood that you have. So this is really important to stop the blood loss from the blood vessels called hemostasis. And I want to discuss that. If you have everything intact and there's no problem here, then the endothelium, if it's healthy and it's not broken, it will send off signals to say, we don't need the platelets to come over here. And the platelets are floating around. They're fragments of cells, and they're floating around in the plasma. So they're just waiting for a message to come over there and plug the hole. I remember P for platelets and P for plug because they go together. So collagen being exposed will actually cause 2 pathways to happen. One is the platelet plug formation, and the other one is the coagulation cascade. And if you look this up in your book, the coagulation cascade that we are talking about is the intrinsic pathway. That is the only one that we'll be talking about in this class. We won't be talking about the extrinsic pathway. Yes, that's the only one we'll be talking about. I just checked it. So it is labeled as the intrinsic pathway. So we need to go over both of these pathways because together they work to stop the blood loss from this broken blood vessel and allow time for healing so that you can get all those layers back intact and be healthy and well. So collagen exposed is step 1 for both pathways. For step 2 is the platelets will stick. And I'm talking about them sticking to the exposed collagen. Because if you don't have collagen exposed, then the platelets won't stick. And that's good. I told you if the endothelium is healthy, then the platelets can't see the collagen, so they won't stick. Sometimes if people take an aspirin a day or a half an aspirin a day, especially elderly people, then that will prevent this step. So they will bleed a lot more, but we're trying to prevent them from having spontaneous platelets sticking. And especially if a atherosclerotic plaque ruptures, that can also make collagen be exposed. It's very dangerous. But what would happen is the collagen here would attract the platelets and they would start to stick here, and actually they can recruit other platelets and they can send a message out saying come over here, and they're calling in the forces. So that would be step 3, recruit, and they're recruiting more platelets. That is how you get a plug. So that is a platelet plug. Platelets stick, they recruit more platelets, and it forms a plug. Remember, platelets are not actually cells. They are cell fragments. So they can't, hopefully you learned that in anatomy, they can't divide, they don't have a nucleus, but they do have lots of proteins. And these proteins are involved in signaling here to bring over more platelets. Yay! Okay, at the same time the coagulation cascade will be happening. That's because this plug is unstable. It is basically just a pile of platelets. Don't you like how I'm using all those P words? It's just a pile of platelets. And that's what you end up with, right there. So it's unstable. And as the blood is swooshing by this location, it could easily knock that platelet plug off. So it needs to be stabilized. And that is what your coagulation cascade is all about. So when the collagen's exposed, there are tissue factors over here. I'll just label them F. These are proteins that are dissolved here. We should probably add that to our list in the plasma. Also dissolved proteins. Mainly I'm talking about globular proteins because water can surround them. They look polar. Oh, and you also have antibodies, lots and lots of proteins in the plasma. So these factors are proteins and they're floating around out here. And you don't want the factors to set off the cascade without collagen being exposed first. Because the way the coagulation cascade works is one factor will activate another factor, which will activate another factor. Now, these have Roman numerals and you don't need to memorize them. And they're not in any order that you're going to understand. They're in the order in which they were discovered. So it actually starts with factor 12, which is annoying. And then it goes to factor 11 and then factor 9. And so you don't need to memorize the order. But in order to make the factors, you have to have vitamin K. So I'll write that down for you because you might find it interesting that Coumadin, for example, is a medication that interferes with vitamin K being used to make these factors. So we would call it a blood thinner, but it actually doesn't thin your blood. It just means these factors can't be made, so you can't get the cascade to take place. Normally, we'll set up a cascade. And the final one that you want to take place is, finally, factor 10 allows thrombin to be made. And thrombin is an enzyme. It is the last in the pathway. Now when thrombin is made, I need to get that off the paper. Hang on just one second. No, there. Now you can see it better. When thrombin is made, it's an enzyme. So here's our enzyme thrombin. And it works to take in profibrin and send out fibrin. Now, what is fibrin? It's a long, stringy protein that will wrap itself around this plug. So together, these will make a stable clot. So we're using the fibrin, and we're using the platelets, and we have made a stable clot. You don't want this to take place spontaneously in the bloodstream, or you might have a heart attack or a stroke. There are also some medications which are anticoagulants that will interfere with this pathway. Antithrombins like heparin. You could also have a problem with this pathway if it's a genetic problem with making the factors, and that's hemophilia. So hemophiliacs have trouble making those factors. So lots of things you maybe have heard of with interfering with coagulation. Both of these happen at the same time, and that's in a healthy individual a good thing because it means that you will get reduced blood loss here.